My fiancée said she could do better, so I canceled the wedding. My fiancée looked me in the eyes and said, "My parents think I can do better than you." Then she added something even worse. "Sometimes I think they might be right." I only said 2 words, "Then do it." By sunrise, I was gone. 1 week later, her entire family found me at my best friend's apartment. They were begging me to come back, not because they were sorry, because 280 people had already been invited to a wedding that no longer had a groom. My name is Ethan. I'm 31 years old, and I'm an architect. People imagine that when someone breaks your heart, you immediately start shouting. You demand answers. You remind them of everything you've done. You beg them to reconsider. But sometimes, none of that happens. Sometimes the first thing you feel is calm. Not peace, not yet. Just the strange calm that arrives when someone finally says out loud what their behavior has been telling you for years. I met Rebecca 3 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was intelligent, funny, and curious in a way that made people feel interesting. At the time, I was working at a small architecture firm downtown. The hours were long, the salary was modest, but I loved the work. Rebecca was finishing a master's degree in communications. For the first year, our relationship was simple. We cooked in my tiny kitchen. We drove around the city on Sundays while I pointed out buildings I admired. I would start explaining how a staircase could change the feeling of a room, or how the placement of one window could completely transform a space. Rebecca used to laugh and tell me that my hands started drawing in the air whenever I became excited. She said she loved that about me. I want to remember that version of her honestly. She was not pretending during every good moment. We really did love each other. That is what made everything that followed so difficult. The problem began when I met her parents, Howard and Vivian. Howard owned a successful import business. He had built it himself and made sure everyone knew it. Vivian treated social status like a second career. She sat on charity boards, belonged to an expensive country club, and could tell you which families mattered before she could tell you whether they were kind. The first time Rebecca brought me to their home, Howard shook my hand and asked what I did. "I'm an architect," I said. "I work at a firm downtown." "An employee," he replied. It wasn't a question, it was a classification. "For now," I said. He smiled at me the way adults smile at children who announce that they are going to become astronauts. That dinner established the pattern. Rebecca's parents rarely insulted me directly. They preferred jokes. Jokes allowed them to hurt me and then criticize my sense of humor if I reacted. Rebecca has always had expensive taste. Hopefully she can adjust. Everyone laughed. Vivian's friend's daughter married a surgeon. Beautiful wedding. The kind people remember. A glance in my direction. Architecture is respectable, I suppose, but the money is slow, very slow. And then there was the phrase Howard returned to repeatedly. Rebecca could have done so much better. Sometimes he said it when he thought I couldn't hear him. Sometimes he made sure I could. Once, after 2 glasses of wine, he described me to one of his friends as the boy who isn't much yet. Yet. That single word kept me coming back. It made the disrespect sound temporary, as though one more promotion, one larger project, or one better suit might eventually make me enough. I want to be honest about my role in this. I tolerated it. I laughed when I wanted to leave. I accepted invitations to dinners where I knew I would be judged. I told myself I was being mature, patient, secure. The truth was less flattering. I wanted their approval. I wanted Howard to look at me one day and admit that he had been wrong. I spent years trying to pass an exam written by people who had already decided I would fail. My best friend Marcus saw it before I did. One evening, he was helping me carry architectural drawings into my apartment. We were halfway up the stairs when he stopped. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When her parents say those things about you, what does Rebecca do?" "What do you mean?" "Does she stop them?" "She doesn't like confrontation." "That isn't what I asked." I shifted the drawings under my arm. "She usually changes the subject." "Has she ever said, 'That's my boyfriend, don't talk about him that way'?" I tried to think of an example. I couldn't. Marcus nodded slowly. "Just pay attention to who defends you when you're not the one talking." I told him he was reading too much into it. He wasn't. What Howard and Vivian didn't know was that I had been quietly building something of my own. I worked at the firm during the day. At night, I accepted freelance projects.
kitchen renovations, small offices, retail spaces, a restaurant redesign that was later featured in a local magazine. I saved almost everything I earned from those projects. 18 months before the wedding, I used those savings for a down payment on an apartment. The deed was in my name. The mortgage was in my name. Rebecca moved in with me and contributed toward utilities and groceries, but she had not contributed to the down payment. Her parents assumed she was helping support me. Rebecca knew they believed that. She never corrected them. Neither did I. I told myself that explaining my finances would seem desperate. Part of me was also afraid that the truth would not change their opinion. The wedding was scheduled for June. 280 guests. Vivian insisted on using the country club. Howard offered to pay for the entire celebration, but only if he controlled the guest list, the menu, the music, the ceremony, and even the wording on the invitations. Rebecca said she didn't want our wedding to become one of her father's business events. She asked if we could pay for most of it ourselves. I agreed. I covered the venue deposit, the photographer, the florist, and the catering reservation. Rebecca paid for her dress and several smaller expenses. Howard continued promising that he would contribute later. But every promise came with another condition. 3 weeks before the wedding, Rebecca returned from lunch with her mother.
She walked into the apartment and barely spoke. I knew something was wrong. We were standing in the kitchen when she finally said, "My parents sat me down today." About what? The wedding. Us. Everything. I waited. They think we're making a mistake. That isn't new. They think I'm committing to a life that might never be enough for me. I stared at her. What does that mean? It means they're worried. Your parents have been worried since they discovered I receive a salary. That's not fair. It's accurate. Rebecca crossed her arms. They think I can do better than you. There it was, not hidden inside a joke, not whispered in another room, right in our kitchen. I waited for her to reject it. She didn't. Instead, she said, "And honestly, sometimes I wonder if they see something I don't." I felt something inside me become very still. Do you agree with them? I don't know. That is not an answer. She looked away. I love you. But love doesn't pay for everything. We are not struggling. Not now. What are you afraid of? That this is it? I looked around the apartment. The apartment I had bought. The furniture we had chosen. The wedding documents spread across the counter. What exactly is this? A life where everything takes years, where we always have to plan and save and wait. That's how most people build a life. My parents never had to live that way. Your father built his company over 20 years. But I didn't grow up watching the difficult part. That sentence was probably the most honest thing she said. What do you want, Rebecca? She remained silent. Do you want to postpone the wedding? My parents think we should. I didn't ask what your parents think. She closed her eyes. Then she finally said, maybe postponing would be best. Because you believe you can do better? I didn't say that. You said part of you thinks they may be right. I'm confused. No, you've had 3 years to decide whether I'm enough for you. That isn't fair. I've spent 3 years being evaluated by your family while you stood beside them silently. I never agreed with the way they treated you. You never stopped them. I was trying to keep the peace. You kept their peace. She started crying. I expected myself to soften. Normally, I would have. Instead, I remembered Marcus asking me who defended me when I wasn't talking. The answer was still no one. I looked at Rebecca and said, then do it. She wiped her face. What? Do better. Ethan, don't be dramatic. You want to postpone the wedding because part of you believes your parents are right. I said I'm confused, and I'm done waiting for you to become certain about me. She stared at me. You're ending everything over one conversation? No, I'm ending it after 3 years of the same conversation. She was stunned. I think she expected an argument. She expected me to present evidence of my value, my income, my apartment, my projects, everything I had quietly built. But I finally understood that none of it should have been necessary.
That night, Rebecca slept in the bedroom while I stayed at the kitchen table. I wasn't going to make an emotional decision that could damage either of us financially. I emailed my attorney and requested the earliest available appointment. Then I reviewed every shared expense. The honeymoon account contained money from both of us. I transferred Rebecca's contributions into her personal account and left mine untouched until my attorney could properly document the separation. I canceled the automatic payments connected to wedding vendors. Then I packed 2 suitcases, clothes, my laptop, my drawings, my grandfather's watch. I left the furniture we had chosen together. I did not care enough about a dining table to fight over it. Before sunrise, I placed my key on the counter. Beside it, I left a note. It said, "You are free to find the life you think is better. My attorney will contact you about the apartment and the wedding expenses." Then I left. I stayed with Marcus. His couch was too short, his refrigerator contained almost nothing edible, and I slept better there than I had in months. Rebecca called repeatedly. I did not answer. Her mother called, then her father, then relatives I barely knew. I sent one message to Rebecca. "We will communicate through my attorney until the practical matters are settled." Within the next few days, my attorney sent her formal written notice. Because the apartment was solely in my name, the notice outlined a clear and reasonable timeline for her to move out. I offered to let her keep the furniture and household items. She would receive every dollar she had contributed to the honeymoon account. I would accept the loss of my portion of the non-refundable wedding deposits. I wasn't trying to punish her financially. I was trying to leave cleanly. 1 week later, someone pounded on Marcus's door. He opened it and looked back at me. "You have visitors." Howard stood in the hallway. Vivian was beside him. Rebecca was standing behind them with swollen eyes. Howard entered as though he owned the building. "We need to resolve this." "There is nothing to resolve. 280 people have been invited. I know. The club is charging an enormous cancellation penalty. I paid the original deposit. That doesn't cover the remaining obligation. That agreement was made through your membership." His jaw tightened. Vivian stepped forward. "Do you understand what this is doing to Rebecca?" I looked at her. "Do you understand what your family did to me for 3 years? This is not the time to relitigate every unfortunate comment." Unfortunate comments. That was how she described years of contempt. Howard began talking about misunderstandings, wedding stress, families saying things they didn't mean. He suggested that Rebecca and I continue with the ceremony, not necessarily because everything had been solved, but because canceling so close to the date would create gossip. We could attend the honeymoon, take some space afterward, discuss the relationship privately once people had stopped asking. I stared at him. "You want me to marry your daughter so your friends don't know the wedding failed. That is not what I said. It is exactly what you said." Vivian began crying. "The invitations have already gone out." And then I understood why they had come. They weren't begging for me. They were begging for the seating chart.
Rebecca finally spoke. "Ethan, please." I looked at her. "Please what? Come home so we can talk." We talked. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. You meant it exactly the way it sounded. You just didn't expect me to believe you. I was scared. So was I. Every time I sat at your parents' table and waited to see whether you would defend me. She began crying harder. "I'm sorry." I believed that she was sorry, but regret after consequences is not the same as courage before them. Howard stepped toward me. "You are throwing away 3 years over pride." "No, I spent 3 years throwing away my pride to keep this relationship." I opened the door. "This conversation is over." They left. I closed the door gently. That mattered to me. I did not need to shout for the ending to be final. The wedding was canceled. Some deposits were refunded. Others were lost. Howard and Vivian told people the ceremony had been postponed because of a private family matter. Rebecca moved out of the apartment before the deadline outlined by my attorney. I returned after she left. The place felt unfamiliar. Not because she had taken much, because every room carried a version of the future I had believed we were building. 6 months later, I sold it. I moved into a smaller rental and placed most of the remaining equity into savings. For the next year, I focused on work. Not to prove her parents wrong. At first, maybe part of me did. But anger is unreliable fuel. It burns hot and disappears quickly. What kept me going was the realization that I had spent too long designing my life around people who would never live in it. My freelance work grew steadily, not overnight. I completed restaurant renovations, 2 medical offices, and several residential projects. Some clients were difficult. One project lost money. Another was delayed for months because of permits. I made mistakes. I learned which contracts protected me and which promises meant nothing unless they were written down. 18 months after the breakup, I left my employer. Marcus introduced me to 2 architects he trusted. Together, we founded a small studio. The first year was frightening. We worked from a shared office with unreliable heating. We accepted projects larger firms considered too small. We designed spaces for clients who changed their minds weekly and paid invoices late. But our work improved. One restaurant project received local attention. That led to a boutique hotel renovation. The hotel project led to a residential developer inviting us to submit a proposal. 3 years after I left Rebecca,
Our studio won the largest project of our careers, a residential development in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods. The lead investor belonged to Howard and Vivian's country club and used its private meeting rooms for presentations. That was why I eventually returned to the building where my wedding reception had been planned. Not for revenge, for work. The first investor meeting was held in a conference room near the main dining area. I arrived carrying drawings and presentation boards. As I walked through the club, I saw Howard at his usual table. Vivian was sitting across from him. Howard's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Vivian followed his eyes and turned around. For 1 second, the three of us simply looked at one another. Then one of the investors stepped out of the conference room. "Ethan, they're ready for you. Everyone has been asking to meet the architect behind the design."
Howard heard him. So did Vivian. I nodded politely in their direction. "Good afternoon." Then I continued walking. I did not stop to explain my success. I did not remind Howard that he had once called me an employee, as though that were an insult. I did not ask Vivian whether the project was memorable enough for her. A younger version of me had rehearsed that confrontation countless times. In every imagined version, I said something devastating. The real moment felt different. I no longer needed them to know they had been wrong. Their opinion had stopped being important long before that meeting. Success was not my revenge. It was confirmation that I had never been as small as they needed me to feel. Rebecca contacted me several times over those 3 years. At first, the messages were emotional, then apologetic. Eventually, she sent a letter through a mutual friend. I read it. She wrote that she had spent her entire life confusing her parents' approval with safety. She said she had not known how to choose a life they didn't respect. She admitted that watching me leave without pleading was the first time she understood how expensive their approval had become. I believed her. She was not a monster. She was a grown woman who had never learned to make an important decision without first checking whether her parents approved. Understanding that helped me forgive her. It did not make me want to return. Regret is not readiness, and finally understanding why you hurt someone does not obligate that person to give you another opportunity. I never answered the letter. Today, my studio is still growing. Not every project succeeds. Not every month is easy. I live in a smaller apartment than the one Rebecca and I shared, but it feels like mine in a way that apartment never did. There's a peace that comes from no longer auditioning for your place in someone else's life. I spent 3 years trying to prove that I was enough for people committed to seeing me as less. Walking away was the first time I stopped taking their exam. There is something worse than being alone. It is lying beside someone who makes you feel insufficient, inside a life you helped build, while calling your silence love. I would choose solitude 1,000 times before accepting that again. So let me ask you honestly, if your fiancée told you she believed she could do better, would you have walked away immediately? Or would you have stayed and tried to repair the relationship? And if Rebecca's apology had arrived 1 month after the breakup, instead of 3 years later, should I have given her another chance? Drop your verdict in the comments. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who has spent too long trying to prove their worth to the wrong people. Because here, one story always leads to another.